Hello and welcome back to another EDH deck design video. Today I'm going to be re-recording a deck that's definitely already up. This is my Urabrask the Hidden deck. The previous deck and this deck technically have the same cards, but the previous one I was working on foiling out the whole thing, and it's complete. So I'm just going to replace that video with this. What I've done is I took every single artifact and red card that has this mark right here, this phyrexian watermark, if you can see it. There you go. And I've made an EDH deck out of it. Essentially, you can do this with a couple things. If you've seen my Dimir watermark deck, it's very similar. There's no special lands for this one, so I just use the set lands that have the phyrexian mark up here. A friend of mine used to do this a lot. We kind of used to do it with set symbol decks with the precons. Then when the guilds came back to Return to Ravnica, we did some of those. In Phyrexia, the Phyrexian and Mirror and Watermark ones, you can make just a handful of decks with those. They're not very strong. This is actually more of a role-playing deck, where I take on the role of a half-completed Planeswalker that is in cohorts with Urabrask to complete his great work, to help on the Forge and convert everyone else. I am limited to a very small amount of cards in this pool. For example, I think there's 23 cards, red cards, that have the Phyrexian watermark on it. That's the absolute worst color to do this theme with. The best is black. There are over 60 black cards that have the Phyrexian watermark. Blue and green are very powerful. They're around 40. I think white has a little over 30, but red is the absolute worst. So we have to rely on all of the artifact support. But as a thematic deck that's intended for role-playing, this is not a powerhouse deck. There's no sweet combos in here. This is not a deck tech. This is more of a showcase. There's actually not a lot I can do with this deck. There's about just a handful of cards. I'll show you every single card that could have fit in this deck with this restriction. And you'll see what I'm running and what I'm not. But Urabrask is one of my favorite cards. He's really good. I've run him in a kind of like a sly EDH build before. I really liked him in Standard. He's 5 mana for 4/4 haste. Essentially, all my creatures have haste, and he gives all of my opponents. All my opponents' creatures come in tapped. It's great to shut down Kiki-Jiki immediate combos. But to be honest, he's when lined up with all the other Prey Warders, granted he is the cheapest, he's also got the most minimalistic effect. You can get the same effect by fine-tuning your deck with, say, the Ashling's Prerogative enchantment. It's a 2 mana costing enchantment where you can play even or odd, and you can kind of tune your deck to that. And being a 2 mana drop enchantment is much better than a 5-drop creature. But as the general, he fits. Thematically, it's very fun to play this deck. If you're not much into role-playing, you may not understand what I'm trying to describe, but that's okay. Essentially, the best way to think about it is that while we're playing the game, there's a story arc going on. You approach another Planeswalker like you do when you duel in the magic mythos there. And my general, Urabrask, is a Prey Warder. He's helping me try to complete myself. Phyrexian in the storyline cannot become a Planeswalker, but I'm already a Planeswalker, so I'm somewhere in between. But together, we are going to try to complete the opponent. It's an effect deck, so that's actually all we could really do with this deck, with the pool. So the idea behind my deck is to infect the opponents. Let's stick Urabrask over here and run through the cards real quick. There is literally not a lot to pick from, so every single card here, some of these are just vanilla things that don't make sense. Some are really good. Slag Fiend, for example, is great. It's a 1-drop XX, where X is equal to the number of artifacts in all graveyards. As a themed deck from this specific set, a massive chunk of this deck is artifact. Oh, probably, I think 50% of the deck is artifacts. He is a late-game bomb. This is a very good card in the deck. But most of these are just cute little do-nothings. Peerless Mirror, when he dies, he shocks. Phyrexian Revoker is one of the few expensive cards in the deck. There's about 5 cards in the deck that if I took out, the deck would probably be worth about $20. Phyrexian Revoker is one of the actual expensive ones. He's a pithing needle on a creature. Mirror Sire, just when he dies you get an extra mirror. He's cute. I like the little artwork there. Most people miss the tiny mirror in the artwork. Plague Mirror is our first infect creature. It is also our only technical artifact accelerant, our only accelerant in the entire deck. He taps for colorless, but he's infect. So we got to be careful with these guys if we actually plan on doing what the deck wants us to do. So there's just a handful of them. Necropede is just a 2 for 1/1 infect. Ichor Claws 2 for 1/1 infect. When he becomes blocked, he gets a little bit bigger. When he dies, he gets a counter on something, which is good. I can proliferate later. Immolating Soul Eater. Immolating, that word. It's not an infect, but this is one of the best creatures to put the infect equipment on because he has fire breathing. Phyrexian Digester is not a very good infect creature. He's a little bit low par when it comes to converted mana cost to power toughness ratio. But Razor Swine, same mana cost, same power ratio, has First Strike. First Strike and infect is great because that means I do the infect, the wither damage before they do the damage back. Fallen Ferromancer is also probably one of the better creatures in this deck. When I describe better creatures in the deck, you must understand that the power level of decks that this competes with, they are also thematic. So something like this is like a late game bomb where I can tap to infect people. This is not a very powerful card on its own, but in this, with the meta, this playstyle, thematic, and role-playing and Magic, this does the job. Tormentor Exarch is one of the weirdest Exarchs because it's so exotic to see red getting a negative power effect. Ogre Menial is another one of the really good creatures of the deck because it's fire breathing and infect, and he has knife toughness. Rusted Slasher is kind of awkward. The one toughness there usually means he's just going to trade with something. There is just a small selection of artifacts I wouldn't mind sacrificing. I also have the one single artifact theft spell coming up, so I could sack that to him too. Pierce Strider is an example of what the deck kind of has to deal with. This is a decent creature in some like budget builds, I suppose, but I'm trying to do infect, so losing life doesn't really do much. Core Prowler is great. It's another infect creature, and when he dies, I proliferate. Proliferate meaning I can double, or not double, increase the number of counters on everything. Or +1/+1s, -1, -1s, Planeswalker Loyalty, infect. Corpse Cur is our good recursion where I can get something back from my graveyard. Usually try to hold on to him until something else dies. 2/2 bodies for 4 kind of sucks. Again, this is another example of just poor quality cards I'm playing. This should be, if I was making a legitimate mono red infect EDH deck, this would be like a 5-drop haste creature. You could think like Thundermaw Hellkite or Stormbreath Dragon, something like that. But no, I'm playing the 5 mana 4/2 haste that I can lose life at. He's decent. In this deck, it's very thematic to be like, during our confrontation with the other opponent, I summon a panther that comes out of nowhere. Things like that, it's fitting for what the deck tries to do. Invader Parasite is actually a really good card. When it enters, I can get rid of a land. You usually see this in a Kiki Jiki deck where you're trying to make copies of creatures. There is a Wormcoil in the deck. That is probably the most expensive, and I think this and Battered Skull. Yeah, one of these is the most expensive cards in the decks. This honestly does not deserve to be in this deck. Like, this card itself is worth more than... Well, if I take this and Battered Skull out, and I think the Blightsteel, just the power level... This is a very powerful card. This deck does not deserve to actually have this card in it. I should probably reprioritize and put this in another deck, but I wanted an off-foil deck. I'll probably take it out eventually. But I mean, Wormcoil is probably one of the best creatures in the whole deck because it's Wormcoil engine. But right next to Wormcoil, same exact mana cost, is a 4/5 vanilla creature that does nothing. Same mana cost, there's a 6 mana 5/5 infect that I have to attack with every turn. Putting gear on this guy is really nice because it kind of, his body's one of the biggest infects I can get for his mana cost. There's another 6 mana vanilla 6/4 that does nothing. So I got a 5/4 and a 6/4 vanilla 6 mana costing creature in the deck. Main deck. Yeah. Molten Steel Dragon is again one of the most powerful creatures in the decks. This is something that my opponents usually know to hold up removal for, since I have this and the equipment and the land that are flying. I only have 3 cards in the whole 100 card setup here that grant me flying. Putting infect on him is usually game ending. And of course there's Big Daddy. One-hit kill machine is not actually a one-hit kill machine in my play group, because in our play group, house rules is infect is 15 damage, which makes this deck very bad to play, because that essentially means I have to do 50% more damage. I also, as you saw, I don't have but a Plague Mirror to help me ramp out. There's one other artifact that it's pseudo ramp, so he's not likely to ever land. He's just not fast. There is a very small spell complement here. Gut Shot is something I've always been tempted to play in a normal mono red deck so I can kill a Birds of Paradise on turn 0. That's usually all this does. It just gets rid of utility creature. Volt Charge is fantastic because I can proliferate. The trouble there is I want to hold on to this till I can proliferate something, but I usually want to use this to remove early aggressive creatures, something that may be killing me. Artillerize should be like the whatever the one that the cheaper one is. That's like, it's not strictly better, but I like it's decent being instant speed. And again, I do have one way of thefting an artifact coming up, but I have a few artifacts I don't mind sacking. This is a really good spell I do run in most of my mono red EDH decks. Instant speed exile of 2 artifacts is actually really good. Active aggression, same thing. I like running this in my normal decks because instant speed active aggression, or active treason, that I can do cheaper is super helpful. Scrapyard Salvo is an interesting card that most likely no one sees outside of like maybe Q or something like that. In this deck, this can be a late game blow. Again, I'm trying to do Infect, but 50% of my deck is artifacts, so this could very likely burn someone for 20 or more. There's an artifact theft. If I can take someone's artifact and sack it, that's great. And then there's an awkward card. This does help get combat through. It's kind of expensive, but it's not a guarantee sometimes. And this is probably one of the worst cards because it's 5 mana for a possible singleton land or artifact destruction. Doesn't really do a lot for that mana cost there. Now let's go on to the equipment. So this is kind of the most important part of the deck. There's not a lot of equipment, but my tiny little creatures, if I give them something to boost them with, they'll get through. This one is probably the second most important one of the deck because it gives anything Infect, including Urabrask or the Dragon. Something like that is fantastic. The rest of them are the living weapon equipment. I get to play with all of them except the one that requires swamps, which is a shame because that one's very powerful. What I usually do, again, role-playing, is I pretend that these are workers of the Forge that have been repurposed to help Urabrask work and continue. For example, Flare Husk is just a minimal worker. Mortarpod is something that helps us jettison packages from one side to the other. Sickle Slicer is just a kind of another generic underground one I usually go with. Skin Wing is one to help us float things around or exit the forge or transport. Again, this is probably one of the more important equipments because I have very little flying in the deck. Bone Hoarder tends to get big. It's thematically I usually play along with the picking dead bodies out or used goblins or something like that. Same thing with Strand Walker, something to pick out dead resources and repurpose them. Then there's Batterskull, which is the best equipment in the entire deck. Doesn't really fit any theme with the Forge, but it's just a really good equipment. And then Necropouncer is a little hasty one, but most people consider the living weapon equipment, except for Batterskull, to be absolutely rubbish. Because they are typically very overcosted. For example, this is a 6 mana that gives me an equipment that gives a creature +3 and 1 haste and costs 2 to equip. But it does enter with a token, so it's technically a creature itself, which has some advantage to it. There's a few combos you can do with the Flare Husk there, with like inner bounces and whatnot to get in for infinite token entries and death triggers and things like that. But in this type of deck, they definitely do a good job. It's mostly thematically with those, like suiting up something with a repurposed shell of a previous Phyrexian that had failed to serve us. Let's go on. The last bit here, there's a massive chunk of artifacts. There's no enchantments in this set that fit in our red set here. Since I am doing Infect, and I do have a few Proliferate effects, I really like this one. If I can even get just 1 Infect damage off, this can save me from having to swing into unfavorable blocks. Again, a nice sack outlet. This is probably one of our 2 ways of actually drawing cards in the deck. Another Proliferate effect, I can just sack some extra stuff I've already used. For example, the Wellsprings. These are kind of our only good like, not really card advantage, but I guess replacement effects. So if I have a nice sack outlet, I can draw an extra card and get an extra basic land. I don't think there's a single thing in this entire deck that uses enter the battlefield triggers. The living weapons circumvent this because they enter the battlefield as an equipment, and then they get a token, so they're not actually entering. So that's really good. Mind Crank is a generic filler, actually. It doesn't really do anything in this deck. I don't really utilize anyone's graveyard, and mill is not what the deck's trying to do, but there's not a lot to really include, so I didn't really have a choice here. I can run, I technically have to run all of the shrines. Well, I don't have to, it's better to run these than some of the other cards. So I have all 5 shrines. This one lets me dig a little bit for an extra card. This one generates just a few extra tokens. This one's good because I can actually burn. This will most likely end up being like my best creature removal spell. Shrine of Boundless Realms is the ramp one where I can get a few extra mana. Something like this I hope survives so I can land the Blightsteel Colossus, but it rarely works. And then the last one is like a discard effect. Again, it's typically not what the deck's trying to do, but it's a thing. Decimator Web is actually probably one of the best artifacts in the deck. Because again, the low powerness here, sometimes my creatures just can't get through to actually infect somebody, but this can actually put an infect counter on somebody. And this is probably one of the second best ones because I can start doubling up on all my junk. Not a lot of powerful artifacts, but what I can make up in quality is in quantity. So like a double Decimator Web, for example, would be fantastic. This is another awkward filler. It doesn't do what this deck really needs. The power level of the cards in the deck is very low, but it's enough of a disruption, I suppose, to help us get through. And Soul Conduit's nifty. You'd think this would be... I did this exact same watermark thing with Jin-Gitaxias, where it's all about experiments. And this one really fits the flavor for his deck, what it wanted to do. But it's actually kind of good in this deck since the infect damage is what I'm trying to do. If I'm being successful, I'm probably going to be taking a beating, but I can switch our life totals, and that'll reset me back to whatever the normal life is, not infect life. We have a double proliferate mechanic, and a really good combo coming up with the lands is the Spine and Phyrexian's Core, so I have repeatable removal. This is a very expensive combo to get online, but in the very casual groups that I play this against, it works out very well. And the last bit is the lands. This is probably where the last few things coming up are the Phyrexian's Core and Inkmoth Nexus are the only 2 non-basics in the entire deck. Inkmoth being the very last expensive card. Everything else in the deck is just so dirt cheap, but again, this is a very important land because it's both infect and flying, so putting equipment on Inkmoth is probably one of our most consistent win conditions. And the rest of them are all these lands. I took these out of my Jessica deck when I finished getting the 7th edition Avon Mountains in there. I like this one best because it's the red Phyrexian Sun and it has the Phyrexian mana symbol here. If you know much of the lore, Urabrask is considered tainted. Well, not quite tainted. Most of the other Praetors look bad at him because he's considered to have more emotion, most likely because the emotion from the red mana sun has warped him. But these are very beautiful. These don't have the watermark. They have a set symbol, but I mean, I'm still holding about 60 some cards that all have this nice little matching watermark here. But that is the current build now. There are just a handful of other cards that could have been in the deck, but I did not feel them suitable enough to include. For example, Furnace Scamp. He's cute. This is a nice little aggressive creature. Again, something I liked in Standard. But in this deck, he's going to just die and he doesn't do enough. So, another example of a poor quality creature is a 3 for a 0/3 that may be a 3/3. That's absolutely terrible. Priest is fantastic if you can combo and make copies, or if you're just jumping out super fast. But in this deck, I don't really have much to do early game, so she doesn't really do anything. Psychosis Crawler was great when I was running this as a Jin-Gitaxias deck. In this deck, I don't have a lot of drawing tech, so it doesn't do anything. Chancellor is probably one of the most awkward Chancellors there is. Chancellor of the Forge, that is. I like most of the other ones, but this is really only good in a deck where you're trying to make copies of him, or you're running like a Warp World or something like that to get lots of extra tokens into play. Rage Extractor is fantastic in casual 60 deck. There's like 4 cards in this deck that have the Phyrexian alternate payment thing, so he doesn't do anything. Surge Node does nothing. Gremlin Mind's cute, doesn't do enough. Conversion Chamber is nice, but very kind of slow. Like, I honestly think this one probably should have had the mirror and watermark too, because the golems are different. Isolation Cell Isolation Cell is more of a your average to low quality Punisher style card. Again, loss of life is not really what this deck needs to do. And Magnetic Mine is probably the absolute worst card to include in this deck, since I'm running around 50 artifacts. Like, again, I don't know why this one has the Phyrexian watermark. This should have been mirror, and it makes more sense. The rest of them are just tokens and counters and whatnot. But as you saw, that's not a lot. Like that little quote-unquote sideboard, it's not a sideboard. Those are just literally every other potential card I could have included in this deck within this restriction. And that's just not enough. Having so few red cards means I'm having to use every single artifact. If I were to do a different color, I would have better cards. Again, this may be a complete waste of time to consider, but it depends on what your group's up to. It's sad to say, I do have a Pauper Fallen Angel deck. It's stronger than this. Because, I mean, I can usually hit for Voltron, or hit for general damage much faster than Urabrask will ever do anything. But if you do have any interest in this, I would definitely consider giving it a try. I don't suggest the red one. I would suggest, if you're doing Phyrexian versus Mirror, try the black one, because you have more powerful cards. You have Skittles and Geth and Massacre Worm and Black Sun Zenith and Shieldred and all these really powerful cards, like the Obliterator, Phyrexian Obliterator, and actual spot removal. Blue's really strong too, because you have a few counter spells, you have Jin-Gitaxias. The reason I took that one apart is if you run Jin-Gitaxias, even in a thematic weakened deck, people are going to target you because you're running Jin-Gitaxias. There's no way around that. It's just a bad idea. Unless you can actually build a deck where you will survive, you won't, because no one wants to see that thing land. The second worst one, being mono white, would be Shieldred. Or not Shieldred, Elesh Norn. She's actually still much better than Urabrask. There's not a lot of good white cards, but Elesh Norn's effect, making all those like 1/1 and 2/2 infect creatures much bigger, is much more powerful than having Urabrask and giving them haste. You can do the mirror inside too. There's a couple legendaries that are also very fun. There's a red-white one and a green-black one. Well, there's a green-black Phyrexian one. There's a lot of different legends to pick from. The alternate there is doing the guilds from Ravnica. Like I've done the Dimir, I have the Rakdos one. Thinking about doing the Izzet one. My friend did. Oh, he did a lot. He did the Orzhov one, which he made off foil, which looked fantastic. If you're doing the guilds, I would suggest the Boros one or the Gruul one, because if you're restricting yourself to just watermark cards, those two have the best optimal win condition, being the aggressive general. Because Rorkthar is already a pretty strong general, and same thing with Ariella. Both of those are very fantastic and aggressive generals. You could also, I suppose, do some of the new watermarks that's coming out, the Sultai and the Jeskai and things like that. Don't think there's enough to actually do a deck yet, though. But, yeah. This is a thematic deck. This is not a very powerful deck. My Pauper deck full of commons is honestly stronger than this. Yeah, I have 1 or 2 bomb cards, but it's just not consistent and aggressive. It's made to play a story. So if you have any ideas or any feedback, there's no real ways to improve this. I'm not changing it. But any feedback, or if you've ever done anything like this, definitely share. It's always cool.